evening. So glad to see so many out here. And everyone is happy after this afternoon's ball game, right? But tonight we're going to have a little different kind of program on archaeology, as it's what it teaches us about Iowa and our crops. And our speaker is Cherie Haury-Artz, who I just met, and I am really looking forward to what she has to say. So, Cherie, please.
Okay, I think I heard David talking to somebody up there saying that he said, we'll get together later and tell farming stories. I'm going to tell you some farming stories today. So let's see, we'll start out just defining our terms. So when we talk about cultivation of plants, I'm going to back up one step too. I'm a zooarchaeologist. I study animal bones from sites. So I have to give credit to, I'm going to be talking about ethnobotany today, the botany, flora side of things. And so I want to give credit to the researchers whom I'm telling you about somebody else's work here. So Bill Green, who used to be state archaeologist, David Ash, Doug Jones, who worked in the State Historic Preservation Office. Those are the researchers whose work I'm telling you about today, so I can't take credit. So, but when they have specific terms that they use. So when they talk about cultivation, it refers to the process of humans deliberately interfering with plants. And what they mean by that is people might, if there's a nice patch of sunflowers or something that you want to come back and get the seeds for later, maybe you pull down the weeds around it. Or maybe you carry water during a drought period of time. You're still using the wild plants, but you're helping them along a little bit. But then when we talk about domestication, we're talking about actual genetic changes in the plants. Which changes them, and ethnobotanists can identify those. And we'll talk about a little bit more about what they're looking for when they do it. So, kind of washed out slide on the big screen, but everybody has heard about the Fertile Crescent. That's what we all learned about in school, as the beginning of agriculture. But what many people don't hear about is that plants were domesticated in many other centers all around the world, not just in the Middle East. And so there were like 3 major time periods at which point domestication began. And the earliest one is between 9,000 and 7,000 years ago, BC, 9,000, 7,000 BC. So in the Fertile Crescent, they were doing small grains. They were doing wheat, barley, peas, lentils, pistachios, almonds. But then if you go to China, they had a different set of things that they were domesticating at about the same time period. It's always interesting to me how things, independent invention, sort of roughly the same time, things occur around the world. So they had rice, peaches, soybeans, chestnuts, tea, Chinese cabbages. In India, rice again, bananas, sugarcane, coconut, cucumber, and jute, a useful plant. This one wasn't a food plant, but it was for making rope and things like that. And then we come over to the New World, which many people neglect in their words. The Western Hemisphere, New World and Old World, is kind of a strange construct. But in Mexico and Central America, we were getting corn or maize, beans, squash, peppers, pumpkins, avocado, cotton, cacao. What would we do without chocolate? At least me. In South America, potatoes, sweet potatoes, cassava, beans, cotton, peppers, peanuts. Think about the staple foods that we eat and how many of them come from the New World. Corn, beans, pumpkins, chocolate, potatoes. These are peanuts. Between those, that's the diet of most elementary school children, right there. And then in Africa, a little later, about 5,000 to 3,000 BC, we see sorghum, pearl millet, cowpeas, melons, and coffee, the other essential, and oil palms. So all around the world during this time period, people are beginning to discover that they can genetically manipulate plants. This probably starts out as cultivation, helping them out a little bit, bringing them water, tearing down the weeds, things like that. But then they start to actually select plants. So it's just like if you were breeding dogs or horses and you want one with a certain pattern of spots. So you take all the puppies that have the right pattern that you want and you allow them to breed. And then gradually you come up with a breed of dog where they all come out with those spots. Same thing for plants. If you want oily plants or juicy plants or starchy plants or whatever you want, people are starting to select the plants that are giving them the nutritional elements that they want and actually beginning to genetically modify the plants. And we're going to zoom in now to the American bottoms. This was another center of domestication. And here we see, these are plants that were all native to the Midwest. We see sunflowers, Kinapodium, which is probably you know it as lamb's quarters or goosefoot. And you're all nodding. I tell this to elementary school kids and I get crickets. Polygonum or erect knotweed, little barley, gourds, amaranth, and tobacco are all native to the American bottoms. So that's right here, down here, where the Mississippi and the Missouri come together around the area of St. Louis. And you'll recognize that, so this was one of the centers of domestication of plants. And you can recognize, of course, that it's a quick hop up the Mississippi River to southeastern Iowa. So this is where we find, no surprise, some of the earliest cultigens in the state of Iowa are showing up there in southeastern Iowa. So how do we know? What do archaeologists look for? We can find direct evidence. If seeds get charred, they preserve really well in the archaeological record. So charred seeds would get direct evidence. Here we see these are charred sunflower seeds from an archaeological site. We can also see plant parts. Nutshells are good. Rinds, corn cobs, corn cupules, the little things that hold the corn seeds in place. Phytoliths, which are the silicate structures in the stems of plants, and pollen. And what we're seeing over here is an electron micrograph of pollen. So these things can all be recovered from archaeological sites. So these are all clues about what people were eating. We also have indirect evidence. We find charred residue on the insides of pots. You can scrape that off and send it to the chemists, and they can do an analysis and tell you what it is that people were eating in that container. We find artifacts that are used for cultivation. You start finding rakes and hoes. You know, somebody's using those for something. And then we actually find there are 3 sites now in Iowa that have raised fields. So we actually find the ridged fields, ancient gardens that are 900 to 1,000 years old. We have flotation, and I bet I'm not hooked up to the internet, so this may not work. We'll see if I can get it to play. Oh, it's working, yay. This is how a flotation machine works. We bring back dirt from features, so if we have a fireplace or a hearth or something like that, we bring the dirt back, we dump it into this machine where water jets are squirting up from the bottom. You reach in there, you sloosh around with it, and you can see small bits of things float to the top. They flow over the top and onto this hardware cloth. And this is how we recover really teeny tiny things like plant seeds. and fish scales and bones and teeth from mice and voles and things like that. And then, of course, some lucky lab tech gets to sit there with their microscope and sort it all out. Oops, gone. So this is something, kind of thing that you might get from your flotation screen. And if you look at it, the longer you look at it, the more things you'll see. You might see here some burned animal bones. This stuff makes me happy. Beads. This particular one is from Iowa Indian Village in Van Buren County. So they have some trade goods here, and we have these tiny little glass trade beads there. And then you can also see over here, we have charred nutshells and bits of other charred plant remains. So you get the lab tech, and she's sitting there with her microscope and her good playlist on her music and sorting all this stuff out. And then it would go to the various analysts who will continue on with their work. So evidence for domestication. How do you tell a wild plant seed from a domestic plant seed? You look for changes in the seeds themselves. You can look for a larger size in the seed. You can look for, people tended to pick things that had a thinner seed coat. That means they germinate more quickly. So evidence of that. And we have extended geographical range of plants. So it may grow wild in southwestern Iowa and somebody's dragged it up to Minnesota. It's out of its geographic range, but when we start finding it up there, well, corn was domesticated. It's a wild plant in Mexico. It's definitely out of its geographic range now. It has also definitely morphed. This is teosinte. This is the ancestor of corn, the wild ancestor of corn. So just pick one pod. This was a couple pods. Here's one pod. And you can come up and look at this later. It's got like 4 or 5 little seeds in it. So picture this compared to what corn looks like now. And you see the kinds of changes that humans can do on plants. And then very high frequency and abundance of remains at a site, more than you would find naturally. You might have a natural range of sunflower seeds because they grow wild here, but suddenly you're finding pits full of them or high concentrations of them, and you know something's going on here. So this is the evidence that they look for. And this little seed over here, this is an electron micrograph of a Kinapod seed or goosefoot. Again, something you can look at later. That's what they look like. They're tiny little things. This is why I do bison bones. They're tiny. But when you examine it under an electron microscope, you can start looking for these physical changes that the ethnobotanists look for. And so here we have the teosinte up close. You can see it's a little shell. You can see the corn in it. There's 4 or 5 little seeds there. But Native Americans, through centuries of selection, came up with not one kind of corn, but hundreds of different kinds of corn. One of the things that we tend to miss in the modern day and age, we tend to want to start leaning towards monocropping, but the Native Americans, historic, the Hidatsa, the Mandan in North Dakota, when they first encountered Europeans, Lewis and Clark spent their first winter with the Mandan up in North Dakota. There's a Hidatsa woman who was an informant of an anthropologist named Gilbert Wilson. Her name was Buffalo Bird Woman. And she explained that they had 19 different kinds of corn. And each different corn had different attributes. Some were flint corns, they were harder, some were good for flour corn, some were good for eating green, some matured early, Some matured late, some were drought tolerant, others were cold tolerant. Living in North Dakota, that's, things that are important. So something survived. If you had a really hot, dry year, those drought tolerant corns are going to save you. If the frost came in August, like it can do in North Dakota, those cold tolerant corns are going to save you. So they had a lot of corn. She said, the quote is, she said, "We understood that corn can travel. And that if you don't plant your variety, if you plant them too close together, the species will mix." So they had a good understanding of genetics. They may not have called it that, but they knew what they were doing. And so many, many differences. Potatoes are even better. 3,000 varieties of potatoes were grown in South America. The mistake the Irish made was by just taking one kind of potato over there. So when the potato famine hit, it was wiped out. And the Peruvians were like, no, no, no. You got to have a lot of different kinds as insurance. So now that people start having agriculture, it has a lot of benefits. You have a much more reliable food supply, which means that your population in one place can increase. People tend to stay in one place longer. You don't have to move around as frequently. Surpluses of food and other goods means you start getting specialized labor. Not everybody has to be participating in food acquisition every day. Sometimes you end up with new stratified societies. You have the farmers, and now you can have the artisans because they can trade their artwork for food from the farmers. And often you find development of elites. So now you've got the priests and the politicians and things like that who are theoretically doing something to support you while somebody else is working in the fields. And then you can have more technological innovations, which lead to more improvement of agriculture. When you have surplus, you can begin to trade with other people. You begin to have a lot more interactions, trade, transportation, things like that. So a lot of things, once you have that stable food supply, a lot of things begin to change culturally. So if we look at Iowa's archaeological timeline, people have been living in Iowa for more than 13,000 years. Native Americans began moving into the state at the end of the last ice age. As the climate, they went through climate change there, as the ice age began to end, the glaciers are retreating, the climate becomes warmer and drier. Archaeologists divide things up into little boxes and put names on them. So they're all Native Americans. So we talk about the Paleo-Indians, but no, they're Native Americans, but they lived in the Paleo-Indian period. And then, so we have what we call the Archaic Period. This is a good 8,000 years of people are hunter-gatherers. They're gathering wild plants. They're doing a lot, hunting many diverse kinds of animals. We see evidence of lots of fishing. We see grinding stones and things like that that are telling us that people are collecting and processing plants. And then, right here, backward, whoa, downward. There. At the end of the Archaic Period, something dramatic happens. So it's about 3,000 years ago, and we see the evidence at the beginning of agriculture in Iowa. And these are those seeds that are coming up from the American bottoms into southeastern Iowa. And so from the end of the Archaic Period, trigger happy, to the end of the Woodland Period, we have 2,000 years here where people were growing native plants. These were undoubtedly plants that people had been collecting for these last 8,000 years before that. They were collecting wild plants. They knew their properties. They knew what was good. And now people are beginning to domesticate those same plants. And then, about 1,000 years ago, corn finally gets here. It's been working its way up for 7,000 years from Mexico. But a lot of people are unaware that Native Americans have been farming in Iowa for 2,000 years before corn got here. So the story is of a site called Gast Springs in Louisa County, adjacent to the Mississippi River Valley. This is where we find evidence of the very first tentative steps towards farming in Iowa. You can see they were in a cornfield, but down deep in the depths of this site, they discovered a feature. This was a collection of charcoal, fire-cracked rock, and it was gathered up and taken back to a flotation machine, and in it they found evidence of squash, goosefoot, and the first evidence in the Midwest for the cultivation of little barley. That one seems to be an Iowa specialty. You don't see that one down in the American bottoms. Iowa was doing little barley. So what were the first farmers growing? Sunflowers. Native plants on the Great Plains. From the very end of the Archaic Period, we start seeing evidence for domestication of sunflowers. They were also, this is polygonum, or erect knotweed. I always hasten to add that this is different from there's an invasive knotweed that is giving farmers big pain now. It's an Asian invasive. It's different from the erect knotweed. This one only gets to be about this high. It probably might look familiar to you. It's got tiny little pink flowers, and inside each one of those little pink flowers is a tiny little black seed. Kinapod, goosefoot, or lamb's quarter. If those names aren't familiar, you know you've seen it. All of these plants, in fact, tend to grow on disturbed ground. So places, along the roadsides and things like that, along the sides of railroad tracks, you will often see this. You can eat the greens of lamb's quarters. It's nutritious. It's got natural iron and calcium in it, and it pretty much tastes like spinach. And then you have the tiny little seeds, which are starchy, and so that's a good energy food in the wintertime. You need your starches and your carbs to keep you warm and keep you going in the wintertime. This is another attempt at photographing erect knotweed. It gives me a hard time trying to get it to stay in focus. But this one is another starchy seed. It was cooked in a variety of different ways. You can grind it up into a meal. You can throw it into the pot and it'll thicken the stew, like making gravy. It was also used for medicinal purposes in some Native American groups. And it was also used for dyes and mixing with, it was called kiniki, I can't say it. It was a mixture of herbs that they used for smoking. Again, here's a dime. You can see they were into teeny tiny little seeds. Helianthus, or sunflowers. All parts of the sunflower were used. Their seeds are high in fat and protein and calories. We still use them for sunflower seed oil these days. They could boil to extract the oil, or you could parch them and grind them to make meal for the flour. They use the stems as fire starters. Or you can use the strings from the stems for fire sticks and to weave things, use it as a coarse kind of rope. So sunflowers were a very versatile thing. Marsh Elder, again, another oily seed. Two things they were looking for: starchy seeds or oily seeds. You need both your fats and your carbs. Those are the nutritious things that they're looking for. High in protein, calcium, and iron. Marsh elders, or sumpweed. This one is not so familiar unless you live near wetland areas. But you can see the list: protein, calcium, iron, phosphorus, potassium, thiamine, niacin, B-complex vitamins. This one is really good for you. So key sites for the beginning of agriculture in Iowa are found in Lee County, Louisa County, Muscatine County, Des Moines County, all down there in that southeastern corner. One of the things, so I have pictures here of pits. Outline one? I guess not. If you can see the storage pit outline here. So this is the top surface. This is what the archaeologists see when they first come down on it. And then they'll dig a cross section, and you can see the deep pits. And in the absence of being able to can food or freeze food, the only way to store your food, this becomes an issue. Now that you're growing all these great crops, you've got to have food to get you all the way through the winter, right? So you have to come up with a way to store it. What they did was it had to be dried, and then it could be stored in these underground storage pits. These are the first root cellars. And then, coolest thing for archaeologists is when they took the food out and used it, then there's a big hole in the ground, and nobody wants a big hole in the living room floor, so they swept the garbage into it. And of course, these make lovely little trash containers, little time capsules, and archaeologists, nothing we like better than a good garbage pile. And they're all stratified, and you have a snapshot of what was going on at the site at the time that that pit was filled. Here's another view of the Gast Spring site. And this is interesting that all of these early sites are also in ecotonal settings. So the people had access to the Mississippi River bottoms. They had the access to the floodplains and the backwater areas. They had the forests along the tributary streams and the river bottoms, as well as the upland grasslands. So in a very small area, they had access to a variety of different kinds of resources. And this seems to be very common in agricultural, pre-contact agricultural sites. So when we introduce sunflowers, there's the earliest sites with sunflowers in it are concentrated down there. Do you see a pattern? It's on the rivers, right. Which confirms our theory that they're coming right up the Mississippi from St. Louis, on up the Mississippi and inland, up the Des Moines River, and then some of them are coming up the Missouri as well, and inland from that. And as we go through this next series of slides, you see this pattern over and over again. The trade routes are following the water. So these are the sites with cultivated goosefoot. Again, the earliest ones, good old Louisa County. And again, in western Iowa and along the Des Moines River as well. Down there in Lee County as well. These are the sites for the reported cultivation of sumpweed. This one is a little harder to come by. The interesting thing is this one up here in Clayton County appears actually to be earlier than some of the southern ones, which Bill Green suggests tells us that the Iowa natives had been domesticating sumpweed or Marsh Elder on their own. They didn't have to wait for somebody in St. Louis to trade it up. Yay, Clayton County. Polygonum, again, down there in southeastern Iowa, and spreading up through the rivers. This stuff has been, the earliest for the polygonum is about 2,000 years old. It becomes more common in the late woodland and then again in the late prehistoric contexts. So even after corn arrives and beans and squash come shortly thereafter, they continue to grow these indigenous crops as well. The earliest evidence of squash also comes from the Gas Spring site, and it's 2,800 years old. So they were growing an indigenous variety of squash that grows wild in Iowa before they got the other varieties of squash that came up from Mexico and the southeastern United States. Agricultural provided a reliable food supply, a larger population supported in one place. The villages become larger, the villages are occupied for longer periods, and people have to develop a system for storing and producing their food. And it's also no accident that pottery shows up at the same time as agriculture. So I'm going to pause for a minute here and show you some of the goodies that I have. This is a replica of a Scapula Hoe. We find hundreds and hundreds of fragments of Scapula Hoes. This one is made, the replica is based on one that Buffalo Bird woman made for Gilbert Wilson. And apparently the little short handle is accurate. This one is made with a deer scapula, just because they're easier to get than buffalo. But normally they were made with bison shoulder blades. So picture this on the end here. And we find storage pits filled with, so 2 free hoes with every dead buffalo. And the ladies were gathering them up and storing them in storage pits. This is what an unmodified shoulder blade looks like. And you can see it's got this big ridge on it, and it's got this fragile edge along here. And generally speaking, when we find them prepared to be hoes, you find that ridge has been chopped off. Oftentimes these outer edges have been ground and modified as well. So this is the Scapula Hoe. Gourds are not a food source. Actually, you can eat gourds. They're in the family of squashes and pumpkins. But unlike squashes, they dry hard. And then they become really useful. So this one, instead of being made into a birdhouse, this is made into a water jug with a lid or a cup. If you cut it a different way, now you have a dipper or a spoon. And one of a colleague in the Iowa Archaeological Society, in his garden he grew 1 million of these little baby gourds. And as a demonstration, he played a beat the many uses game with them. You can come up and look at this, but all from the gourd this shape, you can have everything from a bowl to eat out of, small mouth containers. These are what we call seed jars. So this is to store your seeds in, or large vessels, large open mouth vessels for cooking in, jars and jugs for hauling water, all 101 different things to make from the exact same shape. So it's a really fun game to play. As the longer you look at it, you can see, oh, you know, if you cut it here, it's different, and if you cut it here, then if you cut it here. So a great deal of creative thinking went into it. Huh?
How do they clean out?
They would probably have a sharp knife made out of a rock or something like that that would clean them out. And then this is not something an archaeologist would find in the archaeological record, but Buffalo Bird woman again demonstrated this. It's a Bentwood Rake made with red willow, and a friend of Lynn Alex's constructed this one using all the traditional techniques, so we have a good rake demonstration too. These, the hoe, Scapula Hoe, a rake, sometimes they were made with deer antlers tied onto the end of a handle, and a fire-hardened stick were the 3 main digging tools. And the ethnographic record, as far back as we know, it was the women who did the farming. and all Native American cultures. But now we see pottery showing up because once you've dried all this stuff, you've tried to eat dried corn and you can't do it. You have to reconstitute it. So now you're soaking things in water, you're making stews and things like that. They did cook without pottery before. They used stone boiling techniques where you drop hot rocks into an animal paunch or something like that, and you can raise it to boiling that way. But now, when you're keeping things boiling over the stove all day long, pottery becomes an important thing. So we see here, this is what a storage feature looks like when you first come down on it in an excavation. This image is from the North Dakota Heritage Center. It's based on a painting of one of those big Earth Lodge villages that Lewis and Clark visited, the Mandan and Hidatsa, who were major corn farming tribes in the Midwest. And so this just shows how corn was dried and your crops. So it's raised up on a platform. This keeps the dogs and the children and everything else out of it. Sometimes corn was hung to dry, other times spread on hides and things like that. So we have these raised platforms throughout the village as well. So it had to be really dry, because if you put it in the ground when it's moist, you're going to get mold. Here is a cross-section of one of these. This is a Dixon site out in Woodbury County. This one I did outline for you. So this is what it looks like as the Little Sioux River is eating into this cut bank, and as the bank sloughs off, exposing these nice storage pits. And now we're back in North Dakota. Highly recommend if you're looking for a vacation place. Many people don't think of North Dakota, but north of Bismarck is the Knife River Indian Villages, which is where Lewis and Clark spent their first winter. There are a number of these very large Earth Lodge villages there. You can still see the big depressions from the Earth Lodge. But at the Visitor Center is a reconstructed Earth Lodge, and it is really worth seeing because it's all completely furnished. And you get an idea about exactly, they look pretty comfy cozy, and if you're in North Dakota in the wintertime, having 2-foot thick earthen walls was the thing to do. So they actually look pretty warm and comfy. But this is one of the storage pits in the floor of the Earth Lodge at the Knife River Indian Villages. And you can see there are big holes. You have to have a ladder to get down inside them. These ladies were growing surplus of plants. They could not only feed their entire family, but they had enough surplus left over that they became quite the traders. They traded with other Native American tribes, especially we've got the Dakota up there who gave up farming and took the horses, but came to the agricultural tribes to trade for corn or steal it. And the women also became important traders when the Europeans came too. So the ladies were the wheeling and dealing with their crops. The crops belonged to them, and they could dispose of them as they wished. So the evolution of a cache pit, this is again based on Buffalo Bird Woman's information. The pit was narrow, generally wider at the bottom, narrow at the top. It was lined with grasses. And then it was filled with dried corn cobs on the outside, loose corn and dried squash and beans down the middle. And then the top was sealed over with wood and animal hides, and then the thing was completely buried to seal the ground. I worked with Fred Schneider up in North Dakota, and we decided to test out Buffalo Bird Woman and her storage pit theories. And so we dug one and lined it like she suggested, and then we dug another one and we covered it with plastic, thinking this one will be our control. And as it turned out, when we opened up the one that was covered with plastic, it was nasty. We grew more kinds of mold than you could possibly imagine. And part of that was because the plastic didn't breathe. So the moisture condensed and just dripped right down into it. But Buffalo Bird Woman's that was covered with hides and wood and was allowed to breathe, that worked. So she knew from what she was talking about. But then again, as I say, after it's emptied, it filled up with lovely filling with trash to give us a little time capsule of action there. Storage pits were also used for other purposes. This is a feature. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 or 10 Bison Scapula, all with the spines processed off, stashed away, waiting to be turned into hoes. So here's a processed Bison Scapula ready to go. We find other gardening tools. This one is made with the frontal bone of a bison. And you turn it over and it's concave, and the horn becomes the handle. So this is a good scoop, a grain scoop, or a digging tool, a shovel kind of action. We start finding lots and lots of grinding stones for processing all of your grains and things like that. And lots of different kinds of pottery. Ceramics are a distinguishing artifact associated with agriculture. These on this side are the earliest kinds of pottery we find associated with the Woodland Period. And then when corn comes, the villages get even larger, and we have different varieties of pottery found in association with those. So pottery becomes like changing car styles. These are good markers for archaeologists to determine different time periods and cultural associations. So these are woodland pottery types. We have cord markings on the outside of them, different kinds of designs, stick impressed along the edges to make the little crenellated edges, sticks poked in from the inside out to make bosses, stamps carved out of bone or wood, making designs across them. The conical bottoms, they're suspended over the fire, and it actually, rounded or conical bottoms are actually more efficient because the heat is distributed up the side and your food doesn't burn on the flat bottom. So you have less food concentrated down here. So the heat comes up the side and keeps things moving. So although it looks awkward, it had a reason for doing that. And so now we are entering the late prehistoric period, and this is when corn gets to Iowa. About 1,000 years ago. So far, there's no conclusive evidence of it before AD 1000. Beans are here by AD 1250. Late prehistoric Glenwood. So the interesting thing is where all that stuff that's coming up from the Illinois bottom shows up in southeastern Iowa first. The stuff coming from Mexico and the southwest are showing up in places like Glenwood and Mills County in southwestern Iowa. They're coming from another direction. And now we get serious storage pits. Here's two people standing comfortably in a storage pit there. Here's another person excavating a storage pit. So these women were able to grow enough to feed their families, as well as to trade out and to get the entire village through the winter. This is the time of year, March and April, are what the Iowa call the starving time. This is because you've used up your winter supply of food, but things aren't really quite starting to green up out there as far as availability of any kind of wild fruits and things like that. So March and April were the hardest times to get through. So bigger your storage pits, the more food you could have. And this is just another view of an experimental pot storage pit with the corn around the outside and the loose grains and beans and things on the inside. These are the raised fields I was telling you about. This is in O'Brien County. And the farmer contacted my colleague Lynn Alex and said, there's this field, it's never been plowed. This farm's been in my family for generations. We know nobody's ever plowed there, but every time you drive over this field, you go bum, 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 just like driving over a corduroy road. And they went out and examined it, and sure enough, you can see the ridges of this ancient field. This is what it looks like. If you photograph it with snow on it, you can pick the ridges out. Analysis of the soils. This site is on a terrace up above the river, but analysis of soils and these ridges showed that it was being brought up from the floodplain and built into these ridges. And the thing that I find kind of interesting is if you see the patterns, it's not all one way. There's different corners and squares and things in different shapes. And Buffalo Bird Woman says that helps prevent the runoff. If it starts to rain and everything starts running down your rows, you're washing your soil away. But if you hit a square, it's going to help keep your erosion down. This is just another view. Trying to image these things is tricky. So there are at least 3 sites now that we know of that have ridged fields in them. They're situated on Upland Bench. This is the Litka site, the one in O'Brien County. About 1 hectare, east to west, trending earthen ridges. They're spaced 1.5 to 2 meters apart, based on the soil carried up from the floodplain. They've formed a supporting base for the plants and enhanced drainage, offered frost protection. Shallow ditches between the ridges may have helped to retain moisture and sheltered beds for the squash and the pumpkins. One of the things we know that rather than growing crops separately, Native American gardeners grow them intermixed. So you plant the corn, and when this is all Buffalo Bird Woman stuff, when the corn is a certain height, you plant the beans right next to it. And then you plant the squash in the middle, in the rows, in between the rows. So as the corn grows up, the beans climb up the corn, so that becomes your bean pole. So the corn is supporting the beans, and the squash has big, wide, flat leaves, squash and pumpkins. That's growing in between the rows, that's keeping the weeds down and holding the moisture in. So the 3 crops are supporting one another and making work less for the ladies. They would then plant sunflowers around the outside, and Buffalo Bird Woman said they believed that the sunflowers attracted bees and other pollinators. So that your bright yellow happy sunflowers are bringing the pollinators into your garden to pollinate the things in between. So there was a lot of method to it. And the other cool thing that I like, Buffalo Bird Woman talks about, they would have a platform in the middle of the garden, and that was where the kids played. Sometimes the women sat out there and sang songs and did other handcrafts and things, but the kids could play on top of it or underneath it in the shade. Moms could be working and kind of know where the kids were, keep their eye on it, and the kids made noises and scared away the scavengers. They were little human scarecrows, keeping the bunnies and the crows and things away just by being noisy, happy children. So ladies were pretty clever. The other thing that fascinates me about this is the Litka site and those ridge fields, and this is a drawing that Buffalo Bird Woman made of their hidatsa gardens at Like a Fish Hook Village. And if you look at the way they're arranged, and you see the way these things are arranged here, I see, and these are two completely different cultures. This is a late prehistoric in Iowa, and this is historic hidatsa in North Dakota. But the arrangements of the fields and the different angles and this little square arrangements strike me as being very similar. So, Buffalo Bird Woman says what they understood about corn genetics. If you plant the hills too close together, you'll have small ears and fewer of them. The stalks of the plant will be weak and dry out. If they're too close together, the plants would touch each other. We call them, they smell each other. The ears wouldn't be good, plump or large. So they had a lot of understanding about plant dynamics. And this is Buffalo Bird Woman's daughter-in-law, but she is demonstrating the use of a scapula hoe here for us. My theory, and it's only my personal theory, I keep thinking, why the short handle when you have to hoe bent over? But my personal theory is that bone is pretty lightweight compared to an iron hoe or something like that. And so I think you see that she's kind of choked up on it, which would allow you to apply a little more force. Whereas an iron hoe, something that's heavy, would, fall down. It also might just give you a little more control, so you're not accidentally whacking your plants. Plant genetics. See, we knew corn could travel. If you want to plant white corn in one field and yellow corn in another, they have to be separated enough or you'll get the mixed corn. We also know that when a field stands alone away from the other fields, it will grow up only to white corn or only to yellow corn. So they understood plant genetics. They may not have known the chemistry of what was going on, but they knew how to select different varieties of corn and the different uses of corn. Slightly different varieties produced different planting seasons. They varied somewhat, so they continued to experiment with it. If they found something that said, oh, this one is a little different and maybe it has a different flavor. So these ladies were also experimenting, continuing along. It wasn't just a frozen tradition. Here's a list of some of the varieties of corn that they had with the words for them. And again, as I said earlier, each one of these has a slightly different texture, a different use, a different micro-ecotone, whether they can tolerate drought or cold or things like that. So more than one variety, for sure. They all have specific uses. Flint corn, kernels are hard, so they have a low water content, so they're resistant to freezing. Flour corn, soft and starchy, most commonly used today for flour. It's drought tolerant. These are just some examples of the different varieties and their different uses. Much better than monocropping. So there is more references. If you just do a Google search for crops of ancient Iowa, you will go to a web page that was put together by David Ash and Bill Green. And you can click on, there's a picture of the plants, and if you click on the sunflowers, then you'll get a lot of information about that. And it's a fun website to just explore and learn something about the different crops. And some references that you might be interested in if you want to follow up on it more. So my story, I'm sticking to it. If you have any questions, I'm happy to try and field some of them. You're welcome to come up and look at some of the things I have up here. There's a tiny little teosinte or Kinapodium.
Question? Did they use irrigation on a regular basis?
And not in Iowa. There is evidence for pre-contact irrigation in the southwest. The Hohokam and the Mogollon cultures dug miles and miles of irrigation ditches, but there's not much evidence of that in Iowa.
Agriculture and just on.
There's the button at the bottom.
Green line or red line?
Green.
Agriculture and domestication are viewed as sort of an advancement. But I've read that the hunter-gatherers were healthier and taller and physically more fit.
There is a mix-up because I have read the same thing. There was anthropologists in Africa who went down and spent detailed analysis asking everybody what they ate every day and how much time they spent hunting and things like that. And as it turned out, the hunters and hunter-gatherers would spend maybe 3 days a week working. And corn is, once corn shows up, we start seeing dental caries and cavities and things because of the sugars in corn. So there are disadvantages, but the reliable food supply and the fact that you can support more people in one place does allow for a more creative, you start to get stratified society, not everybody has to work. You get some more trade going on, so there are advantages to that more stable food supply.
Other questions?
How long would those food pits work? Just one winter? Or?
Yeah, they were just a single season thing. And sometimes if they opened them up, they found out that the mice had gotten into them or something like that and they were spoiled. So you had to have plenty of backup. You sometimes find evidence of mice and gophers being executed in fairly large numbers, and people debating about whether or not it was, a rodent infestation or if they were actually eating ground squirrels.
So
It was on there.
it occurred to me that the people might have been smaller in stature, which might account for some of the use of a shorter handle.
I'm sure that's true, yeah.
But then I wondered, well, how much intermarriage was there between the different groups? Would they deliberately arrange intermarriages so that the groups would be not get inbred?
Yeah, we don't know for sure at all what was going on in the pre-contact period, but if we look at Native American cultures who have been studied by anthropologists and things, there was a lot of variety in different, some groups were matrilineal, where a man and a woman got married, they went to live with her family, and oftentimes there would be several sisters and their husbands and children and mom all living in a single hut or in several lodges, in close proximity. In other cultures, they went to live with his family. There was my friend from the Meskwaki settlement tells about in the wintertime, the Meskwaki would leave their big farming villages and they would go in small groups and live in the bottoms spread out, because then you didn't use up the firewood. If you have 300 people in one place, the firewood's going to get used up. If you only have 15 or 20 in one location, the firewood will last longer. You don't have to go so far in January to get wood. And then they would get back together again in the summertime. Well, Jonathan tells me that this was the time when they broke up. This is when you could shift around. He said if somebody was driving you nuts, you know, you'd go off with somebody else for the winter. And this was a time too when you know, you might meet a girl or a boy, and when you came back together, you went off to their village or something. So within different culture groups, they had systems for what was allowed, who you were allowed to marry or not marry. It was often related to clans and things like that. In fact, even today, the Dene, the Navajo, when they meet each other, the first thing they do is run through their clans. They say, you know, what their mother's clan was and what their father's clan was, and they immediately know how they're, you know, whether they could strike up a romantic relationship or not. They still do that today. When they meet, you exchange clan names. So there were lots of complex social structures like that I think kept, you know, they think they were aware, just like with corn, they were aware that you didn't want a lot of inbreeding among humans as well.
I wondered if they made that connection. So.
Yeah. And it's, you know, it's complicated. Every group has slightly different systems, and again, we can't tell what was going on pre-contact time. Yeah.
You mentioned melons.
Melons were grown, and I think there were native melons in North Dakota. I'm not familiar with any in Iowa. Yeah.
I think I read somewhere that agriculture came on after hunting and gathering, and there was an advantage to having people all together so they could be taxed. You would know what the output was of an individual farmer because they couldn't run away from their farm, and therefore it was easier to tax them. Is there any evidence of that in North America?
And not in North America. They didn't have to worry about taxes. It was more of a food supply, and the women, the interesting thing is that the women controlled it. And even though, you know, if you met a group, they would tell you that this guy is a leader and stuff like that, but who was out trading with the Lakota for buffalo hides was the women with their baskets full of corn and things like that.
What's the evidence for that?
That's all the ethnographic evidence. That was direct observation of how the native people were working in post-contact.
But you assume that happened pre-contact also.
Yeah. We try and extrapolate backwards. Plus, we have stories from them. So, you know, buffalo bird women, their traditions extend way back. So, you know, buffalo bird woman could tell stories about her grandmothers. She knew how to make a scapula hoe, although she lived in the late 1800s. She had an iron hoe, but she remembered from her mothers and her grandmothers how to make a scapula hoe and was able to demonstrate that. So those traditions, their oral traditions, go way, way back.
Thank you.
Did we get all the questions? Boy, you've been a really good audience here.
You've mentioned sunflowers in many different contexts.
Mm-hmm.
My context for sunflowers was they were a weed that we had to chop out of the cornfield. When did that sort of change?
Well, people have recognized you know, the economic use. If you travel in North Dakota now, you will see fields full of sunflowers. You know, they're a high dollar crop now. In places where they're wild, then they become weeds. All of those plants, Kinapod, goosefoot, polygonum, they're all wild plants. They all grow in disturbed ground, and you know, I am forever digging them out of my garden, thinking to myself, I'm growing the wrong stuff. So it's all in the eye of the beholder, I think.
Well, thank you